Okay, so now we have this basic understanding of English migration to the New World, right? The various factors behind it or engendering this outmigration of early English settlers during the early 1600s. And now we could begin to discuss more specifically the various settlement patterns themselves, something I call three variants of early English settlement. And this is going to be distinguished according to region, right? As you see on the slide there, this is New England, but we're also going to talk about the Chesapeake region, that is to say Virginia, and also the Mid-Atlantic area, Pennsylvania, Maryland. So each area is, of course, distinguished according to region, but it's important to take account here in your note taking the differences between all three areas based upon, let's say, demographics, economics, politics, religion, right? In fact, I just mentioned in a previous discussion here that, there was this decentralized approach to English settlement when it came to politics and religion. Well, it doesn't surprise us that, for example, in New England, their religion will be different based than, say, um, Pennsylvania. All right. So this is a study in contrast. In other words, it's important to take note of the differentiation here when we discuss the three variants. So let's begin first with the case of New England. Even though they're not the first English settlement, as you know, and I believe I discussed in an earlier slide, the first settlement was Chesapeake, or to be more specific, Jamestown in 1607. Okay, but I will say this, that the largest migration of English persons from England to the New World that occurred during the first half of the 1600s was indeed from England to New England, okay? That's to say the Puritans. So, to understand the Puritan world, we need to discuss really a lot about their religion, not in a theological sense, but more a historical sense. Um, and we need to, uh, in other words, discuss what is Reformation. Now, again, this is going to be a very basic um, discussion. A lot of ink has been spilled by historians and academics about this crucial event in world history itself. Okay. All right. So Christianity, as you know, has a history beginning in, with the birth of Jesus, right? And then the spread of Jesus' teachings throughout um, the world of antiquity, right? As you know, even the Roman Empire actually was converted because their emperor converted, right? So the Roman Empire was itself Christian by the time it collapsed, all right? But from the Roman Empire, you see it spreading, Christianity that is, spreading throughout Europe. Now, at that time, Christianity was the same thing as what we call Catholicism. There was no Protestantism yet, no denominations that were familiar with Protestantism, such as Puritans, to take one example, let alone others like Lutherans, Baptists, Anglicans, Episcopalians, Methodists, what have you, right? The Christian world, Christendom, is really synonymous with the Catholic Church. And again, if you know anything about the Catholic Church, still today it's known for being very traditional, very rigid, kind of unflexible, unwilling to keep up with modern times, even today. Um, I believe the Catholic Church is one of the last Christian denominations, using that word loosely, that don't allow their priests to marry, right? As one example of it being traditional. In fact, they still um, have some prayers that are spoken in Latin, right? Even today. Okay, so it's traditional and it's also hierarchical, meaning that it's based on this authority system that's based on a hierarchy, right, of leadership. As you know, there's the Pope on top, and the capital, if you will, is the Vatican in Rome. And beneath the Pope, you see this hierarchy comprised of bishops and so on and so forth. I'm not even sure exactly how it works, but in a general sense, just understand that it's very centralized, to use our concept we've been using. Okay, with the Pope on top, and what the Pope says pretty much goes throughout the Catholic world. Now, during this time, we're talking about the early modern period. You see mounting criticisms leveled towards the Catholic Church. Okay, a lot of it was theological, meaning you know, um, they were criticizing the traditional theology, right, of Catholicism. But a lot of it was also um, criticism whereby charges of corruption were being leveled towards the Catholic Church. Okay, so um, another way to say this is, you know, the critics were charging the Roman Catholic world as being not only theologically rigid, but also being too involved in worldly affairs rather than spiritual affairs, to the point where they're becoming corrupt. All right. Now, what is one example of this corruption? Well, during the early 1500s, to provide one example, there was this common practice called the sale of indulgences. The sale of indulgences. Okay, what is an indulgence? Well, if you know anything about the Catholic world or just the Christian world in general, your ultimate concern as a Christian is your salvation status, right? Supposedly at the end of your life, you're going to be judged based on your actions, according to many faiths, right, within the Christian world. Not all of them, but and we'll discuss that. But you're just at the end of the life of your life, excuse me, and you're going to heaven, hell, or maybe somewhere in between, called purgatory, right, based on your actions that were committed supposedly on your own free will. So your soul transmigrates, right? And that's salvation if you go to heaven. So that's your concern. If you're a Christian, and let's remember, you're leaving the feudal historical period towards the early modern period. The feudal period is immersed in Christianity. So, the common person back then, during the feudal times, and certainly the early modern times, uh, the common person was just concerned about living his or her life and then hopefully gaining salvation. So salvation mattered the most, right? Now, there came around this practices of what I mentioned earlier, priests that would sell indulgences. And basically, indulgences were these, if you will, promissory note that guaranteed that the person or the Christian who bought this from the priest were guaranteed to go to heaven. They were going to be saved, in other words. Okay, but they had to pay for it. Now, even for the person of ordinary means, right? Let alone someone who's poor back then, which the majority were during the early modern period. This was very much an enticement to get an indulgence, right? You would feel a lot better, to put it mildly, if you had an indulgence in your possession, guaranteeing you're going to go to heaven. So you did whatever you can to buy that thing. A lot of people saved up for years. They scrapped and saved, and then, if they were lucky, they bought this indulgence. Now, is there any connection between this piece of paper and going to heaven? Of course not. The priests were just trying to make money. All right. So that's one example of corruption that was widespread during on the eve of Reformation, when you put it that way. But in a general sense, critics were saying the Catholic Church again was too worldly, too focused upon these fancy cathedrals with statues, elaborate statues, and all the fancy paintings in church that cost a lot of money. And who supported that were the people in the form of tithes, right? You pay for the church if you're a commoner. And all these rituals that were happening, and so on and so forth. They felt that had nothing to do with going to heaven. Now, usually, especially during the feudal times, you didn't dare. There were some brave souls who did it, but most persons, you didn't dare criticize the church because you're probably going to be burnt alive, or you might be excommunicated, that is to say, cast away from the church. But during the early modern period, you do see the beginning of dissidents or critics leveling charges against the Catholic Church, and they were brave people to do that. Okay, foremost among them during this time period we are at in this course is Martin Luther. Okay, you may have heard of him. And Martin Luther is famous for nailing on this cathedral in Wittenberg, what's now called Germany, his thesis, right? 95 Thesis is basically his argument against the Catholic Church. So, of course, he's punished for this, excommunicated. But what that does at that particular time, it was probably a perfect time in the history of Christianity for this to happen. Rather than most Christians rejecting Martin Luther, they began to sympathize with him, in fact, began to agree with him. There are certain reasons behind this. For example, they started, the printing press was invented, so they could start spreading, the message of these critics like Martin Luther. That's one factor. But overall, you see many commoners starting to say, yeah, I'm behind the teachings of someone like Martin Luther. So what happened is a critical mass of critics formed, especially in the aftermath of Martin Luther in 1517 when he did that famous act, to the point where the Christian world splintered into two umbrellas, if you will. Okay, the first umbrella remains the Catholic Church. The second one is the Protestant, the collection of Protestant denominations. Okay, let's just call it Protestantism. Right, so the Catholic Church remains one umbrella, and it's monolithic. It's only Catholic. But the second one is Protestants, and Protestants include various denominations, like I just mentioned earlier. Puritans, Calvinists, Methodists, and so forth. Okay, but one thing they all have in common, Protestantism, that is they were born out of that revolt that was in many ways led by Martin Luther. And, they reject a lot of the precepts and protocols of Catholicism. Now, I should mention this, that even in the Protestant world, there's different Protestant denominations who don't like each other, right? For example, the Anglicans during this time, the Anglican Church, did not like Puritans. Okay. All right. So there's still a lot of religious strife that's happening here. All right. So let's return to the case of Puritans moving out of England. Now, the Puritans were one example among several of Protestant denominations. They called themselves Puritans because they really felt they were purifying Christianity. They were eliminating what was unneeded, what was unnecessary to gain salvation. Okay. In fact, there's still an adjective today that we use. It's puritanical. Okay, you may have heard of that adjective to describe someone or some people. Puritanical means you don't engage in any pleasure seeking whatsoever. Okay, you're just doing things that are really basic and not very fun, right? You get that adjective we use today from the Puritans back then. Puritans, in other words, were notorious for not seeking pleasure whatsoever. You don't dress in fancy clothes at all. No dancing, right? You could only sing hymns during Sabbath, for example. No card playing, stuff like that. No games. You don't even celebrate Easter or Christmas. Why? It doesn't say to do that in the Bible, right? That you have to celebrate it. So they don't do it. And speaking of that, they reject a lot of the sacraments that was associated with the Catholic Church. A lot of the ritualistic prayers, they reject it. They're saying that has nothing to do with salvation. What really mattered to them was a relationship between the worshiper and God Himself, right? It was like a personal relationship, but it was mediated by the minister. Okay, the minister still played an important role in the Puritan life, spiritual life. Okay, now Puritans in England, the mother country, were actually well off. Why? Because they were heavily involved in, in commerce, in trade, in business. So compared to the average person, they were well off. They certainly weren't immersed in those Malthusian conditions we talked about earlier. In fact, what they began to see springing up in the city, that is to say, impoverished masses, crime, and vice, and all these things that we call Malthusian. When they see this happening in their own world, they saw that as a sign from God that this place is ungodly and we have to leave. Okay, so they actually did leave. And another reason why they're leaving is also because they're being persecuted by the Anglican Church, which again is the Church of England. So they began to leave England willingly, right? They're trying to find their own niche, if you will, outside of England. At first they go to the Netherlands, but then, as we discussed, the New World is opening up to the English by the early 1600s. So there you go, the brilliant idea. Let's go to the New World and establish our perfect settlement, our ideal Christian community. So that's what happens. Okay, so you see the Puritans arrive. They, arrived in what we call New England today. They say, okay, this looks good, let's settle. And they go on to do so. Now, when we look at them demographically, and I already remarked on this fact that they're more commercial oriented, they're business oriented. So therefore, you see Puritans as more well off. And that's going to be in stark contrast to, for example, Chesapeake, where they're mostly indentured servants. Okay, the vast majority of that population in Virginia. So you have New Englanders, or let's just call them Puritans here. Puritans being more well off. You see a more equal gender ratio between men and women. Why? Because you see whole families of Puritans coming over, right? The entire family coming over. Children, too. You see more children, whole families again. Okay, and they are also commercially oriented. So although religion was certainly the prime mover here, the primary factor in them crossing the Atlantic and dealing with the dangerous conditions in the New World, commerce loomed large. Okay, why? Because they were commercially oriented in England, and they continue to practice that. And as we'll discuss very soon, that habit is going to translate over to what we call the capitalist ethos in New England. That's a future lecture for now, so let's just suspend that for now. All right, so that's them demographically, and we know religiously they are Puritans. Now, in terms of economics, obviously you have to use the land because that's where, in this agrarian in this agrarian world, this agrarian system, you are going to feed yourself. That's your means of subsistence, indeed of survival itself. So you can't ignore, the use of land. So they go there and they began to, of course, employ agricultural methods. But what they're going to do is something called subsistence plus farming. Okay? And what is subsistence plus farming? Well, And again, we're going to see this in contrast with Chesapeake. Subsistence plus farming that was undertaken by the Puritans is basically engaging in what you could call diversified agriculture, where you plant a lot of things to eat, like a lot of crops, but you also produce extra. Okay, that's where the plus comes in subsistence plus. Why are you growing extra? Because you want to sell it on the market. Okay, in order to make some extra money, right? In order to make profit. All right. So the fact that they decide to engage in subsistence plus farming indicates that even during this early time, right, there is this growing transatlantic market system, right, that's going to, cover not only North America, but going down the Caribbean, right, to wherever the English were there gaining their colonies. And the English colonies in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, as it will be called, are growing sugar. But of course, in New England or Chesapeake, the soil and the climate was not conducive to grow sugar, right? So the Puritans decide to engage in subsistence farming because it makes sense. They have families there, right, to feed, but they grow extra for the market, okay? Curiously enough, or interestingly enough, their surplus food will be ultimately the source of food for African slaves in the Caribbean. Okay, when they sell that surplus to the market, it turns out that the food that they get for this transaction will end up feeding the slaves of English masters in places like Jamaica. Okay, now in terms of politics, the political institution there is known as the Massachusetts Bay Charter. Okay, I should mention this, by the way. This highlights the fact that New England was commercial, is the fact that you had the Massachusetts Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company in New England, okay? So not only was it a religious settlement, it was also a commercial settlement, even though religion, you could say, was the primary concern. Because, you had the presence from the very beginning of the Massachusetts Bay Company, almost from the very beginning. Okay, so what was the primary or the only institution really when it came to politics and law? It was the Massachusetts Bay Charter. And again, it's decentralized, whereby any laws that they came up with was only valid and applicable to Puritans in New England. Okay, these were not English laws that encompassed all of the English colonies in the New World. No, they applied solely to Puritans. This is in contrast with, for example, Spain during the earlier century. Okay, so that's our glimpse of the Puritans here. And as I mentioned again, they're the largest flow of immigrants going to the New World during the first half of the 1600s. So now let's move on with our next video to the Chesapeake region.